What happens when a royal couple accustomed to red carpets, VIP lounges, and helicopters suddenly hears the one word they never expected from an entire nation? No? What really unfolds when Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, two of the most polarizing figures in modern royalty, request a private jet for a high-profile Australian royal-style tour, only to be told bluntly, firmly, and unmistakably to buy their own plane ticket? And more importantly, what does a denial like this actually reveal? About power, about entitlement, about diplomacy, about broken bonds between the Sussexes and governments they once charmed effortlessly? You're about to find out. Because behind the headlines and memes, behind the fiery reactions on social media, behind the carefully crafted statements, strategically leaked whispers, and polished PR narratives, lies a story far more complicated than anyone expected. A story filled with contradiction. A story filled with tension. A story that forces us to ask one burning question. How did Harry and Meghan go from being celebrated guests of Australia to being publicly and unapologetically refused? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The request itself didn't seem unusual, not at first glance. Royal tours have always involved logistics, transport arrangements, and elaborate security coordination. The difference this time wasn't the idea of special travel. It was the scale, the tone, the timing, and above all, the assumption that Australia would automatically say yes simply because the request came from the Sussexes. But before we explore the explosive reaction that followed, let's start with the moment the request landed on an Australian government desk. A moment described by one insider as the email that made everyone in the room stop talking. Imagine that. A room full of high-ranking officials suddenly silent as they read what the Sussexes allegedly demanded, line by line, condition by condition, as if the words themselves carried a kind of electric charge. But what exactly did the email say? Why did it trigger such an intense response? And what was it about this particular request that made the Australian government, normally diplomatic, cautious, and controlled, respond with an uncharacteristically sharp refusal? This is where the details get fascinating, and frustrating, and slightly unbelievable. Because according to sources involved in the early discussions, the Sussex request wasn't simply a private jet. It was a private jet of a specific type, outfitted with a specific interior, staffed with specific personnel, and timed with a specific set of non-negotiable flight conditions. In other words, not just a jet, but a luxury aircraft normally reserved for heads of state or billionaires who do not like to wait in line for anything, ever. So you might ask, why did Harry and Meghan insist on this? Was it security? Was it comfort? Was it symbolism? Was it simply habit? Or was it a deeper problem? A growing sense that they must present themselves in a way that compensates for no longer being working royals, yet still wanting the appearance of royal stature? These questions matter because they shaped everything that followed. And here's where contradictions begin to appear. On one hand, Harry and Meghan have branded themselves as champions of simplicity, sustainability, mental health, and environmental responsibility. On the other hand, the aircraft they allegedly requested burns more fuel in 1 hour than most families use in a month. That contradiction alone was enough to make officials raise eyebrows. But it didn't end there. Because once the request was forwarded, reviewed, and discussed, one thing became brutally clear. Australia didn't want to set a precedent. If they approved this level of luxury for the Sussexes, individuals who are no longer senior royals, what message would that send to the public? To taxpayers? To the monarchy? Would it imply that Meghan and Harry had equal standing to the Prince and Princess of Wales? Would it blur lines the British monarchy has worked very hard to keep clean, especially after the couple's very public departure? An official later described the debate as a tangled knot of expectations, politics, and protocol. But the ending was simple. The knot was cut, not untied. Now, here's where timing matters. Because this request didn't land during a quiet political moment. It landed at a time when Australia was in the middle of heated national conversations about expenditures, climate responsibility, and governmental transparency. Imagine the reaction if, during such a climate, news leaked that taxpayer funds, or government resources, were being used to fly the Sussexes privately across the country. Australian politicians didn't just fear backlash. They expected it. They could already hear the radio call-in shows, the satirical TV monologues, the fiery commentary on breakfast news panels. So when they saw the request, they didn't see luxury. They saw a headline waiting to happen. A headline no government wanted to own. But here's the twist. The denial wasn't meant for public consumption. In fact, the initial refusal was discreet, internal, and intended to remain confidential. The government thought the matter would end there. They thought this was the kind of disagreement that dissolves quietly, never reaching the public sphere. They were wrong. Because someone, somewhere, someone with access, someone with motive, someone with just the right amount of frustration or curiosity or political instinct, leaked it. And once the leak began to spread, everything changed. Suddenly, the Sussexes weren't just dealing with a rejection. They were dealing with a global embarrassment. And so the story didn't stay in Canberra. It didn't stay among diplomatic staff or advisory teams. It didn't stay behind closed doors. It erupted. Across continents. Across news cycles. Across every corner of the internet. Memes emerged mocking Meghan for expecting princess privileges. Commentators in the UK treated it as proof of Sussex entitlement. American outlets took a more sympathetic tone, framing it as harsh treatment. Australian newspapers, meanwhile, had a field day. Because nothing entertains Australians more than deflating a royal bubble. But before we get carried away with the international firestorm, let's go back to the very moment the Sussexes found out about the refusal. Reportedly, the reaction inside their team was immediate and volatile. Meghan was said to be shocked. Harry was said to be furious. Advisors scrambled. PR teams drafted statements that were never released. Calls were made. One insider said, "It was like watching a storm build in slow motion." Another likened it to a match dropped in dry grass. And both descriptions were accurate, because what started as a logistical disagreement quickly became personal for the Sussexes, deeply personal. After all, Australia wasn't just another country on a map. It was one of the few places where Harry and Meghan were once adored. Their 2018 tour was a triumph. Crowds cheered for them. Newspapers praised them. Even the most cynical commentators admitted they brought energy to the royal family. That memory made the refusal sting even more. How could the same nation that welcomed them with open arms now tell them, effectively, to fly commercial? But let's push deeper. Because the emotional reaction wasn't simply about wounded pride. It was also about what this refusal symbolized in a larger sense. The shifting global perception of the Sussexes. In 2018, they represented freshness, charm, hope, modernity. In 2025, they represent controversy, conflict, unpredictability. Time has changed their image. Public sentiment has shifted. And whether they admit it or not, Australia's refusal was a reflection of that shift. It was a mirror held up to their journey. A mirror that revealed how far they've traveled from their early popularity. Now pause for a moment and ask yourself, if you were in their position, how would you react? Would you be angry? Embarrassed? Confused? Defiant? Would you try to fix it? Ignore it? Spin it? Or would you wonder how things spiraled this far? These questions aren't hypothetical. They sit at the heart of the Sussexes' response, because they tried all of those reactions at once. And none of them worked. But here's where things take another unexpected turn. Because while the Sussexes attempted to control the narrative, someone else was working behind the scenes to escalate it. A politician. A whistleblower. A journalist. A rival. Maybe more than one. Someone decided this story wasn't just news, it was ammunition. And that decision transformed the situation from an awkward refusal into a public relations disaster. By now you're probably wondering, who leaked it? Why? What did the leak contain? What political or personal motive lay beneath the surface? That's the question international media scrambled to answer. And it's the question we'll unravel chapter by chapter. Because the leak didn't just expose the jet request. It exposed competing agendas, hidden tensions, and a level of backstage drama that would make even a Hollywood screenwriter raise an eyebrow. But before we dive into the explosive details, before we examine the Australian officials who pushed back, before we review the confidential memos that circulated behind closed doors, before we reveal how Kensington Palace reacted, before we uncover what was said during those heated phone calls, before we dissect the moment this story went global, there's one more piece of the puzzle you need to understand. One more moment that set everything else in motion. Because days before Australia issued its refusal, someone in the UK had already quietly warned that this request might not go the way the Sussexes hoped. And that person might have been the first domino in a chain reaction no one could stop. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if the moment Australia said no wasn't actually the beginning of the conflict at all? What if the real spark? The moment the entire situation shifted from routine planning to international embarrassment happened days earlier, in a quiet office, in front of a puzzled staffer who stared at an email longer than anyone should stare at a single piece of text. That's where this begins. That's where the story actually ignites. Because before the leak, before the media frenzy, before the political outrage, someone in Australia opened an email from the Sussexes team and realized instantly that the coming week would not be normal. And here's the question to you, the audience. Have you ever seen something so unexpected, so bold, so mismatched with context, that you reread it just to make sure you weren't hallucinating? That was the moment. According to insiders, this request didn't just raise eyebrows. It raised blood pressure. It raised debates. And it raised the single most explosive question behind the entire scandal. What level of privilege did Meghan and Harry believe they still possessed? The email was polished, formal, wrapped in the diplomatic phrasing you expect from teams accustomed to royal coordination. But between the lines, the message was unmistakable. The Sussexes wanted a private jet, and not just any jet. One equivalent to the aircraft used by the Governor-General, the Prime Minister, or, in certain cases, senior working royals. A jet with a security crew, a jet with controlled entry, a jet with pre-cleared landing rights, a jet large enough to carry aides, wardrobe, media staff, personal protection officers, and specialized equipment. A jet that symbolized status. A jet that signaled authority. A jet that, to Australian officials, said something unintended but loud. Treat us like royalty, even if the institution no longer does. And this is where the contradictions begin. Because according to the Sussexes' public messaging, they have long positioned themselves as modern, minimalist, environmentally conscious figures challenging the old structures of privilege. They speak about simplicity. They criticize the excesses of monarchy. They warn about the dangers of elitism. Yet here was a request that contradicted every one of those messages. How do you reconcile that? How does a government already sensitive to environmental and financial scrutiny justify a carbon-heavy, taxpayer-funded royal-style jet for two individuals who voluntarily stepped away from the system that normally provides it? This is the emotional core of the chapter, the tension between image and action, between ideals and expectations. Now imagine yourself as the Australian official tasked with evaluating this request. Imagine reading the specifications. A particular Boeing or Gulfstream class, fully staffed, fully secured, on standby for the entire duration of the tour. Imagine reading the clause suggesting the aircraft should not be shared with other diplomatic or governmental passengers, even if it had unused seats. Imagine reading the requirement that the jet should be available for flexible scheduling adjustments at the Sussexes' discretion. And finally, imagine reading the soft implication, never stated outright, but woven through the tone, that the jet was less a request and more an expectation. What would you think? What would you feel? Amusement? Annoyance? Suspicion? Or, like the officials who reportedly saw it, would you feel a slow, rising sense of disbelief? Because here's the twist. The Australian government had already been debating whether to fund any royal-style tour involving the Sussexes at all. Not out of disrespect, not out of disinterest, but out of practicality. Harry and Meghan are not senior royals anymore. They do not represent the crown in an official capacity. Their tours are not state obligations. They are personal, charitable, and public relations oriented. And when an event isn't official, the financial burden traditionally shifts away from the host government. This is protocol. This is precedent. This is common sense. So when the Sussexes team requested a private jet of this magnitude, it wasn't just bold. It contradicted the very foundation of their new identity as independent public figures. But here's where the emotional beats deepen. For Harry, security has always been the shadow in the room. Every decision he makes, every travel plan, every appearance, every negotiation is tinted by past trauma. And this request, according to some sources, was significantly driven by his fear of insufficient protection during international travel. To him, a private jet wasn't a luxury. It was a barrier against potential danger. Yet that context, though human and understandable, was not fully communicated in the request. Without it, the email read as entitlement. With it, the email reads as fear. And that contrast, that push and pull between perception and intention, fueled the storm that followed. Meanwhile, Meghan's input reportedly shaped the tone of the request. She is meticulous about image, presentation, optics. And she understands how travel logistics directly affect the quality of their public appearances. A commercial flight means exhaustion, exposure, unpredictability, delays, and zero control. A private jet means precision. It means dignity. It means arriving refreshed and camera-ready. To Meghan, this wasn't about extravagance. It was about protecting the brand they built. But again, intentions were not the issue. The issue was the expectation that Australia would foot the bill or provide the service. And that expectation clashed directly with the reality that governments answer to taxpayers, not celebrity preference. So the internal reaction in Australia was swift. Staffers forwarded the email. Advisors discussed it. Senior officials met to review it. And within hours, the word spreading through the corridors wasn't outrage, it was disbelief. How did the Sussexes not anticipate how this would land? How did they not foresee the public relations consequences if word leaked? How did they not understand Australia's political climate, where government spending is scrutinized relentlessly? But the biggest question was this: who had encouraged them to make such a request in the first place? And this is where things get interesting. Because sources later claimed that Harry and Meghan made the request with confidence precisely because someone in the UK, someone with influence, suggested it would be approved. Someone implied the Australian government would accommodate them. Someone encouraged them to act like royals, even though their status has long since shifted into a gray zone. Who was that someone? A former advisor? A royal insider? A politician? A friendly contact? This thread becomes crucial later. But for now, remember this: the Sussexes did not believe they were overreaching. They believed they were following normal procedure. The internal shock in Australia revealed the disconnect between perception and reality. Let's add another emotional layer. Because when Australia drafted its private reply, the initial no, they didn't use harsh words. They didn't humiliate. They didn't scold. They simply stated that the government could not accommodate the request due to protocol, resource allocation, and current policy. A polite refusal. A professional boundary. But here's where the story flips. The Sussexes reportedly believed the refusal was negotiable, that it was the beginning of a dialogue, not the end. And this misunderstanding widened the chasm between both sides. The Sussexes thought they could persuade. Australia thought the matter was closed. Two interpretations. One spark. And from that spark, everything else ignited. Because while Australia believed the matter was settled, the Sussexes team, frustrated, anxious, and aware that the tour dates were approaching, discussed alternatives. They considered pushing back, revising the request, involving third parties, or framing the private jet as a security necessity rather than a luxury. And that's when the tone inside the Sussex camp shifted. That's when tension started to build. That's when someone made a call that would later be described as a mistake. A call that made the situation harder, not easier. A call that made Australian staffers realize the Sussexes still expected a solution. And a call that made someone in Australia decide to talk. But before we reach that phone call, and the leak that followed, we need to understand the final moment inside the Australian office. The moment an official looked around the room and said something that would define the entire narrative. If they want to come to Australia, they can book their own flight like everyone else. That line became the unofficial slogan of the refusal, not because it was insulting, but because it underscored the core theme of the controversy: equal treatment, accountability, fairness, and boundaries. But that wasn't the moment that changed everything. The moment that changed everything happened minutes later, when a second email arrived. From the UK. From someone who should not have been involved. Someone who tried to influence Australia's decision. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if the real plot twist in this entire saga didn't come from Australia, but from London? What if the first domino that set the private jet disaster in motion came not from a bureaucrat in Canberra, not from a concerned Australian politician, not even from the Sussexes themselves, but from a quiet, almost invisible corner of Kensington Palace, the very institution Harry and Meghan spent years trying to distance themselves from. You might already be wondering, why would Kensington Palace care about a tour that had nothing to do with them? Why would anyone there insert themselves into a dispute about a jet, a country, and a couple they claim to have no operational ties with anymore? The answer is complicated. The truth is messy. And the consequences? Well, the consequences are exactly why this email from the UK became the secret catalyst that fueled the entire international fallout. Because according to insiders, the second email, the one that landed minutes after Australia's internal refusal, came from someone with an official Kensington Palace address. Someone whose job was not to coordinate Sussex travel. Someone who had no obligation, no requirement, and no authority to influence another government's decision. Yet there it was. A short message, polite in tone, neutral on the surface, but filled with a kind of subtle suggestion that experienced diplomats recognize instantly. Guidance disguised as casual commentary. A message hinting that the Sussexes' request might align with previous arrangements made during royal engagements, and that historical precedent supported similar accommodations. Historical precedent. Think about that phrase for a moment. What precedent? The Sussexes are no longer working royals. They no longer represent the crown. They no longer circulate through Commonwealth tours under the auspices of the monarchy. And yet here was a palace official implying, carefully, indirectly, that perhaps the Australian government should consider treating them as if they still did. And this is where motives become murky, because Kensington Palace rarely makes mistakes this sloppy. They are deliberate, structured, controlled. So the first question that arises is simple. Was the email sent intentionally or accidentally? Did the sender know the request contradicted established protocol? Did they understand the political climate in Australia? Did they anticipate how any perceived palace interference would be interpreted, both by the Australian government and by the Sussexes? Or was this an attempt to undermine Harry and Meghan quietly, using only a single gentle nudge in the wrong direction? If you think that sounds conspiratorial, consider this. The relationship between the Sussexes and Kensington Palace has been strained for years. The rivalry between the Waleses and the Sussexes has been whispered about endlessly. And there is a long, well-documented history of palace briefings, off-the-record tips, and behind-the-scenes maneuvering intended to shape public perception. So let's go deeper. Why would Kensington Palace want Australia to say no? Why would they risk appearing to interfere? The answer may lie in something simple yet powerful: optics. Imagine the global messaging if the Sussexes had been granted a luxury private jet provided by a foreign government during a tour they organized independently of the monarchy. What would that imply? Status, legitimacy, influence, authority, and worse, equality. Kensington Palace, according to many royal insiders, is profoundly sensitive about one issue above all others: maintaining the hierarchy of the British monarchy. The Prince and Princess of Wales cannot appear to be on the same level as the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. And if the Sussexes conducted a successful, government-funded, VIP-style royal tour across Australia, complete with a private jet, they would appear, at least symbolically, to still hold royal status. That illusion would be dangerous. It would blur lines the palace has spent years drawing sharply. There's another layer. Australia is a Commonwealth country. Commonwealth tours are traditionally carried out by senior working royals, usually William and Catherine, sometimes Charles and Camilla before the Ascension, occasionally Princess Anne. If Harry and Meghan executed an unauthorized royal-style tour on Commonwealth soil, it would be interpreted as a challenge to the established order. And Kensington Palace, already navigating turbulence within the family, would not want even the faintest suggestion that the Sussexes operate on their level. So whether the email was meant as a soft correction or a strategic intervention, the message was received loud and clear in Australia. Someone in the UK was nudging them, and not in the direction the Sussexes expected. Now pause and consider the contradictions at play. Harry and Meghan publicly claim to have separated themselves from the institution. They emphasize independence, autonomy, and detachment from royal machinery. And yet, their request, and the palace's quiet involvement, reveals that separation isn't nearly as clean as the world was led to believe. The invisible threads connecting the Sussexes to the royal institution still exist. They tug, they twist, they knot. Sometimes they even strangle. And this email proved that even after years of division, the palace still shadows their moves, whether to guide them, correct them, or stop them entirely. Once Australia received the palace's message, internal confusion erupted. Some officials wondered whether refusing the jet might create diplomatic tension with the UK. Others questioned whether this meant the Sussexes should be treated as quasi-official representatives of the crown. A few even feared backlash if they were seen as disrespecting royal tradition, even though the tour had nothing to do with royal tradition. And that brief uncertainty, the flicker of hesitation caused by Kensington's email, nearly reshaped the decision. But here's where Australia's assertiveness comes into full focus. Government officials, after consulting protocol experts, realized something crucial. The Sussexes were acting independently. Any palace attempt to influence the matter was informal, not official, and as one advisor reportedly put it sharply, if the palace wants to coordinate their tours, they should keep their own house in order. So Australia ignored the suggestion. Politely, quietly, but firmly, the refusal stood. And this is when the situation spiraled for the Sussexes, because when their team learned that Australia had denied the request despite the palace's subtle involvement, they assumed the palace had sabotaged them. Suddenly, a logistical issue became an emotional minefield. Old resentments resurfaced. The wounds of past betrayals reopened. The Sussexes reportedly believed that someone in the palace had intentionally interfered to embarrass them, to diminish them, to remind them that, without the crown, their influence has limits. And who could blame them for suspecting it? After years of leaks, counter-leaks, press briefings, and conflicting narratives, trust was long gone. Every action is now interpreted through a lens of suspicion. Every message is dissected. Every gesture becomes political. And so, inside the Sussex camp, anger began to simmer. Was the palace trying to make them look entitled? Were they trying to ensure the tour became a disaster? Were they reminding Australia that Harry and Meghan are outsiders now? Here's the emotional punch. The Sussexes reportedly had two wildly different reactions to this betrayal. Meghan, ever strategic, allegedly tried to manage the fallout, analyze the palace's motive, and consider ways to spin the situation to their advantage. Harry, however, took it personally, deeply personally, and that emotional divide between strategy and vulnerability added another layer of tension behind the scenes. Imagine a couple under pressure, both reacting from different emotional instincts, with advisors scrambling to calm the atmosphere. Meanwhile, on the palace side, something else was happening. A growing realization that the email had unintentionally poured gasoline on a diplomatic fire. Kensington staffers monitored the situation carefully, aware that their involvement might be discovered. The palace, after all, thrives on deniability. They prefer influence without fingerprints, direction without visibility. And in this case, the email risked exposing an inconvenient truth. The palace still tracks and reacts to Sussex movements. Let's fast forward to the next emotional beat. Australia, having reaffirmed its refusal, now felt even more justified after the palace's attempt to nudge them. They weren't just saying no to a private jet. They were standing their ground against the perception of being pressured by royal institutions. And that's exactly the mentality that shaped the tone of future political commentary. The same commentary that would later go viral and intensify the scandal worldwide. Now, here's the twist you didn't see coming. Someone inside Australia, angered by what they saw as palace interference, decided enough was enough. They believed the public deserved to know what really happened. They believed the hidden hand of Kensington Palace should be exposed. And they believed the Sussexes' expectations needed to be held accountable. So they made a decision. A deliberate one. A risky one. They reached out to a journalist. Not with the full story, not yet, but with a question. A question that would become the first breadcrumb in the trail that eventually led to the explosive leak. But the leak didn't come immediately. Not yet. Because something else happened first. Something inside the Sussex team. A single reaction, a move made in frustration. That accelerated everything. And that moment, that decision, was the spark that turned quiet tensions into a global inferno. What if the real reason Australia said no had nothing to do with Harry and Meghan personally, and everything to do with the kind of country Australia has chosen to become. What if the refusal wasn't a rejection of the Sussexes, but a declaration of independence from the very type of royal expectations that modern Australia no longer wishes to entertain? Because once the palace email faded into the background and the initial shock of the jet request settled, the Australian government began asking itself a much bigger and far more uncomfortable question. What does it mean to host a royal-style tour in a nation that increasingly questions whether the monarchy should exist at all? This, right here, is where our story deepens. Because to understand why Australia finally said no, you have to understand the political climate, the cultural identity, and the evolving relationship between Australia and the Crown. Australia is not the same place it was in 1954 when the Queen's visit shut down cities. It's not the same place it was in 1983 when Charles and Diana drew crowds of hundreds of thousands. It's not even the same place it was in 2018 when Harry and Meghan were treated like global celebrities rather than royal dignitaries. Australia today is a country wrestling with big questions about national identity, independence, republicanism, indigenous reconciliation, and public spending. It is a country far more likely to challenge authority than defer to it. So when the Sussexes' request landed in Canberra, officials didn't just see a travel arrangement. They saw a symbolic moment. A test. A question. Does Australia still subsidize royal expectations? And if so, why? But beyond symbolism, there were practical reasons, real, tangible, administrative reasons, that shaped the refusal. The first was cost. Private jets are expensive, yes, but the specific aircraft requested by the Sussex team came with operational expenses that stretched well beyond normal government allowances. Fuel, crew, maintenance, landing fees, security clearance, standby hours. The cost wasn't hundreds of thousands. It was millions. And Australia, dealing with budget pressures, climate commitments, and public scrutiny of government spending, simply could not justify providing that level of luxury for a couple who were not visiting in an official state capacity. This is where the public versus private tension becomes critical. When William and Catherine visit, the tour is authorized by the Crown. It has diplomatic justification. It is part of the constitutional structure. Harry and Meghan, however, were acting independently. They were not invited by the Australian government to represent the monarchy. They were organizing a charitable and media-adjacent visit. That distinction matters more than anyone outside diplomatic circles realizes. Now add the environmental angle. Australia is under pressure to reduce emissions. Politicians are grilled daily about sustainability, climate targets, and carbon-heavy activities. A government-funded private jet for two globally famous environmental advocates, who have spoken repeatedly about reducing carbon footprints, would ignite a firestorm of hypocrisy accusations. Can you imagine the headlines? Can you imagine the viral comments? Do as we say, not as we do. Green speeches, private jet lifestyles. The backlash would be instant and ferocious. And this, more than anything, terrified certain ministers. One advisor described the scenario bluntly. You don't hand your political opponents a loaded weapon. That jet would have been a loaded weapon. But the most surprisingly influential factor wasn't money or environmental policy. It was precedent. Precedent is everything in diplomacy. Once a government approves one request, they must logically approve similar requests in the future. Imagine this. If Australia agreed to fund or coordinate a Sussex private jet, what happens the next time Harry and Meghan want to visit Canada? Or New Zealand? Or South Africa? What happens if another non-working royal requests the same? What happens if celebrities start expecting government-provided flights because they are attending charitable events? Suddenly the line between official and private blurs. And governments do not like blurred lines, because blurred lines lead to political scandals. And yet, as compelling as these reasons were, they weren't the only ones. Something deeper shaped the refusal. Something internal, something emotional, something tied to the Australian identity. Australia has always had a complicated relationship with royalty. They respect the monarchy as a constitutional structure. They admire certain members of the family. But culturally, Australians have never been fond of entitlement. They value humility. They value equality. They value practicality over ceremony. The jet request, whether intended or not, clashed violently with those values. It felt extravagant. It felt presumptuous. And it felt out of step with the attitude Australia expects from public figures. One minister reportedly said, "Why should they get something no ordinary Australian would even dream of?" That sentiment spread quickly within government circles. It wasn't hostility, it was principle. Now let's talk about timing, because timing worsened everything. The request arrived during a period when the government was being slammed in the press for unrelated spending issues. Newspapers were running editorials about government waste. Talk shows were grilling ministers about budget priorities. Opposition leaders were demanding transparency. So imagine approving a seven-figure private jet for a couple who no longer represent the crown. It would be political suicide. The Prime Minister's office reportedly made its position clear early in the internal discussions. "We cannot justify this to the public." And when the Prime Minister's office speaks, departments listen. But perhaps the most surprising pushback came not from elected officials, but from senior civil servants, career diplomats, protocol advisors, security experts, and policy analysts who understood the long-term consequences of bending rules. They examined the request from every angle: legal precedent, constitutional implications, risk analysis, diplomatic impact, public reception. And collectively, they reached the same conclusion: granting the jet would create more problems than it solved. One official summarized it in a line that later became famous within the department: "We don't set protocol based on personalities. We set protocol based on structure." That line was quoted, repeated, and eventually used to justify the final refusal. Now pause and ask yourself, if you were inside that government office, surrounded by advisors warning of political risk, environmental backlash, protocol violations, budget critiques, and public scrutiny, would you say yes? Or would you say no and hope the Sussexes understood the decision wasn't personal? It's easy to see why Australia believed the matter was settled. Their refusal wasn't emotional. It wasn't vindictive. It wasn't intended to humiliate. It was practical, logical, necessary, a line drawn to protect the integrity of their policies. But here's the cruel irony. The Sussexes didn't see the practical logic. They saw the personal slight. They saw the symbolic rejection. They saw a door closing that once had been held open for them. And the Australian government, unaware of how deeply the refusal stung, continued with business as usual, completely unaware that the story was about to escape the walls of bureaucracy and explode onto front pages around the world. Because while the officials believed the decision would remain internal, someone inside the government disagreed. Someone believed transparency mattered more than diplomacy. Someone believed the public deserved to know why the Sussexes weren't traveling privately. Someone believed the narrative needed context before it spiraled out of control. But that person didn't just leak the refusal. They leaked the reason. And the moment that reason reached a certain outspoken Australian politician, everything changed. What if the entire scandal, every headline, every meme, every furious Sussex phone call, could be traced back to one single voice in Australian politics? One politician who looked at the confidential information handed to them and made a split-second decision that would turn a quiet bureaucratic disagreement into a global spectacle? What if the entire world only found out that Harry and Meghan's private jet request had been denied because one elected official decided, "No, the public needs to hear this"? And what if that official wasn't acting out of malice, but out of something far more complicated: principle, ego, political instinct, personal frustration, or maybe even the thrill of being the one who finally said out loud what others only whispered? Because here's the truth: the leak alone didn't ignite the wildfire. Leaks happen all the time. They simmer. They circulate. They die quietly when ignored. What turned this leak into a roaring global inferno was the moment it reached the desk, and then the mouth, of one of Australia's most outspoken political figures. A person notorious for speaking with blunt honesty, cutting commentary, and absolutely zero fear of backlash. A person who, depending on who you ask, is either a hero for transparency or a walking PR disaster. And when this politician opened the email containing the Sussex jet request and the government's refusal, they didn't see diplomacy. They didn't see privacy. They didn't see the need for restraint. They saw a story, a symbol, a perfect example, in their eyes, of the type of entitlement Australians have grown tired of. Imagine the moment. The The politician sits at their desk, schemes the document, raises an eyebrow, and mutters something like, "You've got to be kidding." That immediate reaction, the disbelief, the irritation, the sense of déjà vu, wasn't about the Sussexes specifically. It was about the pattern. The rising tide of high-profile figures asking for exceptions, privileges, and taxpayer-funded perks at a time when ordinary citizens were being told to tighten their belts. You don't need insider sources to know the thought process. It was written all over their eventual public statement. This wasn't just personal frustration. It was political positioning. An opportunity to align themselves with the public's resentment toward double standards. But before this politician went public, they did something that reveals exactly how calculated the move was. They called two advisors. Both warned against speaking out. Both reminded them the Sussexes still had enormous global influence. Both cautioned that publicly criticizing a former senior royal could spark backlash, especially from British tabloids. But the politician didn't back down. In fact, the warnings seemed to strengthen their resolve. Because to them, this was bigger than Harry and Meghan. It was about drawing a line. And if they didn't draw it, who would? So the next morning, during a routine press availability, not even a major event, just a small swarming of reporters outside Parliament House, the moment happened. A journalist asked a completely unrelated question about budget allocations. The politician answered. Then another reporter asked about celebrity expenditures. The politician responded. But then someone tossed a casual, almost playful query. Would the government ever fund a private jet for high-profile visitors like Prince Harry and Meghan Markle? No one expected the answer that followed. Not the reporters, not the staff, not the Australian government, and certainly not the Sussexes. The politician smirked slightly, the kind of smirk that tells you they've been waiting for this exact moment. And then they said it. The line that would be clipped, shared, memed, turned into headlines, and broadcast around the world within hours. If Harry and Meghan want to come to Australia, they can buy their own plane ticket like everyone else. And with that single sentence, sharp, dismissive, undeniable, the scandal snapped into focus. The politician didn't stop there. They went further, adding commentary about fairness, environmental responsibility, and the absurdity of expecting government-funded luxury after stepping away from royal duties. Every sentence was a blow. Every phrase landed with punchline precision. Every word fed the public's appetite for plain-spoken truth. The reporters erupted with questions. Cameras rolled. Microphones tilted forward. And the politician, now fully committed, doubled down. They spoke about protocol breaches, inappropriate expectations, and public accountability. They framed the Sussex request not as a misunderstanding, but as a symbol of the very attitude Australians reject. And here's where the emotional undercurrent kicks in. They weren't just chastising the Sussexes. They were affirming something deeply embedded in Australian identity, the belief that no one, not even royalty, floats above the public. It was the political equivalent of saying, "You're welcome here, but we're not rolling out a gold carpet." Within minutes, the quote hit social media. It spread first among Australian users. Then British royal watchers picked it up. Then American tabloids. Then global entertainment outlets. And each retelling sharpened the tone, amplified the phrasing, and made the politician's comment sound even more cutting than it originally was. But here's the twist. The politician didn't regret it. Not even as the clip racked up millions of views. Not even as royal reporters began calling their office in a frenzy. Not even as British commentators accused them of disrespecting the monarchy. They stood by their words. Proudly. And why? Because the politician understood something the Sussexes team underestimated: public mood. When people are frustrated with their governments, when they are tired of elites, when they are struggling financially, they crave authenticity. They crave bluntness. They crave someone to say what everyone else is thinking. And in that moment, this Australian politician became the voice of a sentiment that had been building quietly for years. They didn't create the outrage, they unleashed it. Now imagine, for a moment, how this looked from the Sussex perspective. 1 minute, they were dealing with a logistical refusal, a private frustration, a disappointment, something that could have remained behind the scenes. The next minute, their names were plastered across international headlines with phrases like fuming, entitled, demanding, shamed, and told no. Their team scrambled. Their advisors warned the story was spiraling. Meghan reportedly felt blindsided. Harry reportedly felt humiliated. And both wondered, perhaps for the first time, whether their brand, so carefully crafted, so fiercely protected, was losing control. But here's where the emotional twist comes in. The politician wasn't done. They gave a radio interview the next day. And if you thought the first comment was bold, the next round made it look tame. They insisted that every visitor to Australia is treated with fairness and that no one should expect taxpayer-funded perks, especially those who've chosen private life over royal responsibility. They emphasized that environmental consistency mattered. They implied, subtly but unmistakably, that the Sussexes were out of touch. And then came the line that became even more viral than the original. If they're independent, then let them act independent. Independence isn't a title. It's a practice. That line hit harder than anyone expected. It echoed across continents. Commentators debated it. Activists applauded it. Critics condemned it. And through it all, the politicians stood firm, unbothered by outrage, empowered by public praise. But here's the crucial part. That line is what convinced the Australian public that the government made the right decision. It framed the refusal not as a rejection of Harry and Meghan, but as a stance of national principle. And once the public sided with the politician, the Sussexes lost control of the narrative entirely. But here's where the deeper complexity lies. The politician didn't act alone. They weren't the original leaker. They weren't the architect of the controversy. They were simply the megaphone. The amplifier. The spark that reached the dry tinder at the perfect moment. But someone else, someone hidden, someone furious, someone inside the bureaucracy, handed them the match. And the question no one has fully answered is this. Why did that insider choose this politician? Why them? Why now? And what connection, if any, did they have to Kensington Palace or the Sussexes themselves? Because uncovering that answer. What if the most explosive reaction to Australia's refusal didn't come from the public, didn't come from Harry, didn't even come from Kensington Palace, but from Meghan herself? What if the moment that politicians' quote hit the airwaves, buy your own plane ticket, triggered a chain reaction inside the Sussex team so intense, so emotional, so chaotic that staffers still talk about it in hushed tones? Because while the world was laughing, mocking, debating, and reposting memes, Meghan Markle wasn't scrolling through social media. She was pacing. She was furious. She was stunned. She was hurt. And above all, she was trying to make sense of something she never expected, being publicly dismissed by a government that once welcomed her like a superstar. Imagine the moment the news reached her. Not through a press release, not through a formal notice, but through a frantic message from an aide who had just seen the politician's viral clip. Meghan was reportedly in the middle of reviewing travel briefs, still hopeful the situation could be salvaged, still convinced the refusal was a misunderstanding. Then suddenly, boom, the clip arrives. A single sentence that transforms the mood instantly. A sentence that sounds more like a punchline than diplomacy. A sentence that strips away the facade of polite refusal and replaces it with public embarrassment. If they want to come, they can buy their own plane ticket. To Meghan, it wasn't just an insult. It was a humiliation. It was a message delivered not behind closed doors, but in front of cameras. It was a reminder that she no longer had the protection of royal machinery shielding her from public ridicule. She reportedly replayed the clip. Once, twice, 3 times. Each time her reaction deepened. From disbelief, to outrage, to a cold, sharp sense of betrayal. And here's where the emotional truth cuts deep. Meghan is used to criticism. She's endured tabloids, trolls, conspiracies, documentaries, and endless think pieces. But this was different. This wasn't a faceless commenter or an anonymous insider. This was a government official standing at a microphone, openly dismissing her in front of the world. And for a woman who built her brand on diplomacy, connection, and global humanitarianism, being treated like an entitled tourist stung in a way she wasn't prepared for. But her anger wasn't just about the remark. It was about the implications behind it. Meghan reportedly asked her team questions, rapid fire, her voice sharp with controlled intensity. Why would they say that publicly? Why would they embarrass us? Why wasn't this handled privately? Who leaked this? How did this get out? And the question beneath all the questions, the one she didn't say out loud, but everyone could feel, was simple. How did we lose control of this narrative? Because Meghan understood media better than anyone in the room. She knew how headlines form. She knew how stories metastasize. And she knew instantly that this wasn't a 3-hour story. This wasn't a blip. This wasn't a minor embarrassment that would quietly fade. This was the beginning of an international news cycle that would paint her and Harry as entitled, ungrateful, out of touch. She could see the narrative forming before the first article was written. She could see the tweets, the jokes, the op-eds, the panel debates. And she knew the damage this could do, not just to their reputations, but to the brand empire they had been meticulously constructing for years. Now let's add another layer. Meghan has always been someone who believes in solving problems through conversation, through strategy, through control. But how do you control a story that has already escaped into the wild? How do you manage an embarrassment that has crossed borders, sparked political commentary, and become a trending topic? Meghan reportedly tried to steady herself, instructing her team to gather every piece of information available: internal memos, emails, notes, timelines. She wanted a full picture. She wanted clarity. She wanted to know exactly how this happened. And as the pieces came together, one detail enraged her more than anything: the involvement of Kensington Palace. Because once Meghan learned that a palace email had been sent to Australia, an email Harry hadn't been warned about, an email that appeared to subtly guide protocol without the Sussexes' knowledge, something inside her snapped. To her, this wasn't just interference. It was sabotage. It was familiar. Too familiar. It reminded her of 2019, of 2020, of the months leading up to their departure from royal life. The briefings, the whispers, the unnamed palace sources that always seemed to know just enough to sway public opinion against her. And now, years later, it felt like the same machinery had quietly moved against them again. She allegedly said something to her team that summed up her entire emotional storm. They always find a way to undermine us. That's the emotional wound. That's the deeper ache beneath the anger. The belief, not unfounded, that forces within the institution still see them as a threat, that they are still being monitored, still being corrected, still being contained, still being punished for stepping outside the system. But the contradiction, the devastating irony, is that the palace didn't intend to sabotage them. The email was vague, subtle, arguably benign. But in Meghan's mind, intent didn't matter. Impact did. Perception did. And Meghan perceived this as yet another example of the rivalry between the two households, a rivalry that has shaped years of headlines. And when Meghan feels cornered, underestimated, or misrepresented, she goes into strategic mode. She tries to take back control. So she called her advisors. She called her PR representatives. She questioned whether a statement should be made. She explored whether the politician's remarks could be framed as inappropriate. She wondered whether to express disappointment publicly or whether to remain silent and let the story burn out. Her team, sensing the volatility of the moment, urged caution. They warned her that any public response would fuel the fire. They told her to wait. They told her to breathe. But Meghan reportedly hated the idea of waiting. She hated the idea of silence. Silence, in her experience, always allowed others to define the story. And yet, she didn't speak publicly. Not yet. She held back. She calculated. But that restraint didn't mean calm. Because behind the scenes, Meghan was directing her frustration in another direction, toward the Australian government. Especially after she learned that not only had a politician shamed them publicly, but an internal official had facilitated the leak in the first place. Meghan was furious that someone inside the government felt comfortable enough to leak sensitive correspondence. She reportedly viewed it as unprofessional, disrespectful, and unethical, and she wondered whether the leak itself was politically motivated, tied to anti-royal sentiment or Republican messaging. Now imagine the emotional storm in the room as Meghan processed all of this. Advisors trying to calm her, assistants updating her on the growing online reactions, security staff waiting quietly at the edges. Harry watching all of this with rising tension of his own. Because while Meghan's response was strategic fury, Harry's was something rawer, more painful, more explosive. But we'll get to him in the next chapter. For now, let's stay with Meghan. Because here's where the twist comes. After hours of internal debate, Meghan made a decision, one her team strongly advised against. She asked for a call to be arranged. A direct call. A call to Australia. Not for optics. Not for diplomacy. Not for negotiation. But because she believed she could salvage the situation personally. She believed that if she could speak directly to the right official, she could clarify the misunderstanding, soften the tone, and reset the dynamic. Meghan has always believed in the power of conversation. She believes she can change minds. She believes she can influence tone. And sometimes she's right. But this time she wasn't. Because that call, the one Meghan insisted on making, did not go the way she expected. The tone was cooler. The respect was present but distant. The answers were firm. The refusal was repeated. And for the first time in a long time, Meghan felt something she rarely experiences in diplomatic spaces: powerlessness. Once the call ended, stunned silence filled the room. But what she didn't know, not yet, was that this call would become the next leak. And that leak was far worse. What if the call Meghan made, the call she believed would calm the situation, clarify intentions, and pull the story back under her control, had the exact opposite effect on Harry? What if the moment Meghan hung up the phone, stunned and shaken, was the moment something inside Harry finally snapped? Because while Meghan processed the situation through strategy, analysis, and diplomacy, Harry processed it through emotion. Raw emotion, sharp emotion, old emotion, the kind that never fully healed. The kind tied to memories of being dismissed, disbelieved, and disrespected long before Australia ever entered the picture. And when that leaked call began circulating behind the scenes, long before it reached the public, Harry's reaction was more explosive, more painful, and more revealing than anything the outside world ever saw. Imagine the scene. Meghan ends the call, sits there in silence, her expression tightened, her composure cracking in the smallest but most telling ways. And Harry, watching her, feels the first jolt of anger surge through him. Because for Harry, seeing Meghan treated coldly, formally, and unyieldingly, especially after everything she's been through, hits him in a way that goes far beyond politics. In his mind, it wasn't just an Australian official shutting a door. It was yet another institution refusing to give his wife the respect he believes she deserves. Another reminder that without the institution's protection, without the palace machinery, Meghan is vulnerable to public insult and bureaucratic dismissal. And that, more than anything, triggers something deep in him, something rooted in trauma. Harry is a man who built his adult life around the belief that he must protect the people he loves because institutions will not. He couldn't protect Diana. He has said it himself. He couldn't shield her from the press. He couldn't shield her from the monarchy's coldness. He couldn't shield her from the forces he believes contributed to her death. That guilt, whether justified or not, never left him. And now, seeing Meghan subjected to public dismissal, harsh commentary, and institutional stonewalling, he feels that old wound reopening. The fear, the helplessness, the anger, the sense that history is repeating itself, not through paparazzi flashes, but through political microphones. So while Meghan sits stunned, Harry stands. He paces. He clenches his fists. He asks sharp, clipped questions. Why did they say that? Why publicly? Why embarrass us? Why didn't they respect the private process? His voice rises. His composure slips. And beneath the anger is something even stronger: fear. Fear that the world is turning on them again. Fear that institutions are closing ranks. Fear that this rejection isn't just about a jet. It's about status, loyalty, hierarchy, power, and whether he and Meghan will forever be treated as outsiders no matter what they do. But here's where the contradiction comes in. Harry knows, logically, that the tour wasn't official. He knows he stepped away from royal duties. He knows he cannot expect the same treatment as senior working royals. He knows all of this. And yet emotionally, he struggles with the reality that choosing independence means losing institutional privilege. And in moments like this, independence doesn't feel empowering. It feels punishing. And that emotion, anger mixed with fear, overrides logic. When Meghan's team informs him that the call she made, private, polite, and intended to resolve tension, was now circulating internally among Australian staff, Harry's fury spikes. Because to him, this isn't just a leak. It's a violation. A deliberate act meant to embarrass Meghan, to belittle their position, to feed the narrative that they are entitled, demanding, and dramatic. He reportedly says something like, They're doing this on purpose. His instinct is paranoid, protective, and deeply personal. In Harry's worldview, leaks are never accidents. They are weapons. And Australia, intentionally or unintentionally, had just fired one. But here's the twist that intensifies everything. Harry doesn't only blame Australia. He blames the palace, the timing of the leak, the context, the sudden emergence of internal commentary, the fact that Kensington Palace had already inserted itself earlier in the process. In Harry's mind, these aren't coincidences, they're patterns. He sees a thread connecting each event, each insult, each leak. A thread that leads straight back to the institution he believes never wanted him and Meghan to succeed outside the royal system. Whether he's right or wrong isn't the point. The point is how deeply he believes it. Now imagine Harry in that moment, pacing, frustrated, agitated, his mind spiraling into a mix of anger and helplessness. Advisors try to calm him. They tell him the story will pass. They tell him not to respond. They tell him to let the moment breathe. But Harry hates letting moments breathe. Letting things breathe is what he did in the past, and those moments always turned into headlines that twisted the truth. He hates silence almost as much as he hates leaks. And for a brief moment, he considers responding publicly. He considers calling out Australia, calling out the politician, calling out the palace, calling out the institution. He feels the urge to defend Meghan with a fire that borders on reckless. But once again, the team urges him not to. They warn him that anger rarely plays well in the press. They warn him that lashing out will confirm the worst assumptions. They warn him that the politician will double down. And slowly, painfully, Harry backs down. But instead of calming him, the restraint makes the storm inside him worse. Because Harry doesn't do well with bottled emotion. It festers. It brews. It becomes something darker. This is where another emotional layer comes in. Harry feels powerless. Not because of the jet, not because of Australia, but because he wanted to protect Meghan, and he couldn't. He couldn't stop the politician's comment from going viral. He couldn't stop the leak. He couldn't stop the criticism. He couldn't stop the narrative from forming. And he couldn't shield Meghan from the humiliation she felt. That sense of helplessness, the sense of being unable to fix the situation, cuts him deeply. It echoes every feeling he's carried since childhood. And that's why his reaction is so intense. Now consider the dynamics between Harry and Meghan in this moment. Meghan is controlled, strategic, bruised but composed. Harry is emotional, reactive, spiraling. Two very different coping mechanisms colliding in a stressful moment. And that collision shapes what happens next. Because as their team tries desperately to manage the fallout, Harry insists they pull all internal documents, all emails, all communications. He wants every detail. He wants to know exactly who said what, who leaked what, who relayed what. And that instinct, natural for him, unintentionally sets off a chain reaction. Because when Harry begins asking for records, someone on their team feels pressured, someone afraid, someone uncertain, someone who reacts poorly under stress. And that person, the most unexpected person in the story so far, makes a mistake. A critical mistake. They reach out to someone in Australia directly, not to resolve the issue, not to calm the narrative, but to question the internal handling of the leak. A message sent in panic. A message sent without authorization. A message that, when received by Australian staff, felt accusatory, intrusive, and inappropriate. That unauthorized outreach triggered alarm bells in Canberra. Suddenly, Australian officials wondered whether the Sussex team was trying to interfere with internal processes, whether they were trying to influence investigations, whether they were trying to identify or pressure the leaker. This turned the situation from diplomatic discomfort into internal government concern. And that concern multiplied quickly. It circulated. It escalated. And for the first time, Australian officials began documenting the Sussexes' actions more carefully. But here's the twist. Harry had no idea that message was sent. He had no idea his team had accidentally made the situation worse. He had no idea that Australian officials were now discussing the possibility of making additional statements if pressure continued. He had no idea that he was about to be pulled into a much bigger storm, one fueled not just by leaks, but by perception, politics, and international scrutiny. Yet the storm was already forming. And Harry, still furious, still emotional, still trying to protect Meghan, was about to learn the next devastating piece of information. Because the next leak wasn't about the jet. It was about the call. Meghan's call. The one she thought was private. And the way that call was portrayed would hit Harry harder than anything that came before.